The ridge had no name on any map that mattered, which was how Idris preferred his last stands. It had a number, tactical reference point 7 kilo 9er. But numbers were for people who expected to file reports afterward, and Idris had stopped expecting that sometime around the second hour of the retreat, when Lieutenant Asher took a burst across the chest, and Idris caught him and set him down in the dust with the same careful attention he'd once given to load-bearing calculations, because the math of the man's remaining weight was the same math either way, and the ridge was the ridge. And the column needed 4 hours. 4 hours. He had run the arithmetic. The pass was 11 meters across at its narrowest. The approach from the valley floor was a single switchback road carved into scree, exposed for 200 meters, one natural choke point at the bend where the rock face jutted out and gave a man with patience and elevation the angle he needed. The approaching force, he counted the dust signatures. 3 vehicles, infantry behind, was configured for speed, not for siege. They expected a retreating unit. They expected noise and disorder and backs turning. They were going to be disappointed. Idris settled into the position the ridge offered him, the way a man settles into a chair he's been building all his life, and began to work. He did not think about the column. He did not think about 4 hours. He thought about the choke point geometry, the ammunition remaining in the 3 rifles he'd consolidated from the dead, the placement of the 2 charges he'd stripped from Asher's kit and set into the road's retaining wall where the switchback bent, the angle of the afternoon sun going copper-red across the dust, the way the light turned the scree into something that looked, from a distance, almost beautiful, and he hummed. Not a song anyone would have recognized. Something low and structural, the kind of sound a man makes when he is concentrating and does not know he is making it, the way turbines hum in the dark of a machinery room when the engineers have gone home and left the systems to themselves. Below the ridge, 40 meters above in a crevice in the rock face, where their courier ship had come down hard enough to crack 2 landing struts and leave them grounded for the duration of whatever this war was doing around them, 6 figures watched. The tallest of them was Veth'ari, third daughter of the Veth'ari convergence, diplomatic envoy, to a war she had no stake in and no business witnessing. She was bioluminescent in the way her kind were faint traceries of blue-gold light running along the lines of her jaw and collarbones and the backs of her long hands, brightening when her attention sharpened, which it had been doing steadily for the last 20 minutes. Veth'ari, her guard captain, stood at her left. He had a soldier's way of taking in a battlefield, quick, lateral, categorizing, and he had taken in this one 3 times now, because the first 2 times had returned the same impossible result. 1, he said, not a question, an inventory. 1, Veth'ari confirmed. The human force consists of 1. She did not answer. The light along her jawline brightened another degree. Below them, the first vehicle reached the switchback bend. The charge in the retaining wall went off. Not loud, precise. The road didn't explode so much as it made a decision, and the decision was to be somewhere other than where the vehicle's front axle expected it to be. The vehicle pitched, overcorrected, came to rest across the road at an angle that blocked the second vehicle perfectly and the third partially, and from the ridge above, Idris was already repositioning, already accounting for the new geometry, already somewhere ahead of what was happening in the way that engineers are always already somewhere ahead of what is happening, because they built the sequence before they lit it. The infantry behind the vehicles went to ground. Idris let them think. Let them calculate the position of the man above and reach their conclusions and begin their flanking movement to the left, up the scree slope, because that was the obvious move and the scree slope was where he wanted them. He settled behind the second rifle. The angle from this position covered the scree approach, which the first position had not, and he waited, and he hummed. Veth'ari had been decorated 3 times by the Convergence's military arm. He had fought in the Pelith reduction, the siege of the second station, The long, ugly grinding campaign on Morrow's Reach, where the line had held for 6 months through sheer accumulated stubbornness. He knew what a soldier looked like working. He had never seen one working alone. "He waved us back," he said, still working through it. "Yes," said Veth'ari. "When I moved to assist, he looked at me and waved me back." "Yes," he said. Veth'ari paused. Their translator had rendered the human's words with the flat precision of a machine that understood language but not inflection. "You'd break the sightline." Veth'ari watched the human shift position again, smooth and unhurried, a craftsman moving between stations. The light along her collarbones was steady now. Steady the way it went when she was in the presence of something she needed to understand completely before she could afford to react to it. "He is managing us," she said, "along with everything else." Below, on the scree slope, the flanking infantry discovered what Idris had laid out for them in the 47 minutes since the column had left him here and the enemy had appeared on the valley road. The discovery was loud. Then it wasn't. He didn't look like a man prepared to die. He looked like a man prepared to work. The Veth'ari did not have a word for what they were watching, so Veth'ari reached for the oldest word they had for things that could not be named. She called it a storm. Not metaphor. In the Veth'ari tradition, a storm was a specific kind of event, a convergence of forces too large and too indifferent for any single awareness to hold all at once, requiring not courage but a kind of radical presence, a willingness to be entirely in the moment because the moment was the only thing there was. The word carried theological weight. It was used for the great gas giant tempests of their homeworld, for the Pelith reduction's worst week, for the moment of childbirth. For things that took you completely. Veth'ari was using it for one human man, with 3 rifles and a ridge. She thought this might be acceptable usage. The second wave came up the valley road 2 hours after the first, reorganized and better configured, infantry forward, vehicles hanging back, flanking elements splitting wide on both sides of the pass. Someone in the valley had done the arithmetic and concluded that a single position could not cover all 3 approach vectors simultaneously. This was correct. It was also, Veth'ari was beginning to understand, not quite the right question. Idris had been busy for 2 hours. The Veth'ari tradition of group combat was ancient and sophisticated and built on a founding truth so obvious it had never needed to be stated. No single body could hold multiple positions at the same time, therefore the group was the minimum viable unit of war. Therefore the individual soldier was always in relation, always part of a formation, always drawing from the network of bodies around them like a node draws from a grid. Remove the network. The node fails. This was not philosophy. This was physics. This was the architecture of violence, and it was as fundamental to Veth'ari as gravity. He watched Idris move through 4 positions in the first 10 minutes of the second engagement, and he did not have language for what he was watching, and his captain's mind, which had never failed him, returned null. "He prepared them," Veth'ari said. "While we were watching, while the first wave was clearing, he was building something." "Yes," said Veth'ari. "He used the wreckage of our ship." Yes, a pause. He did not apologize. Veth'ari absorbed this. He didn't know we were here when he started. Another pause. He knew by the time he used the starboard hull panel as a blast deflector. The light along Veth'ari's jawline pulsed once, slow. What might, in a human face, have been a suppressed smile. "He knew," she confirmed. The left flank of the second wave hit the first prepared position and found it empty. Idris had moved, and was redirected by the empty position's orientation toward the second prepared position, which was also empty, but whose sight lines covered the left flank's new trajectory perfectly. And Idris was in the third position now, which neither the first nor the second position's emptiness would have suggested. And the geometry of it landed in Veth'ari's comprehension like a stone dropped into still water. He is not holding the ridge. He is holding the concept of the ridge. He is fighting the idea they have of where he must be. Below them, Idris paused. There was a lull 90 seconds, perhaps 2 minutes, while the second wave's coordination collapsed and reformed and the valley officers tried to understand what was happening to their flanks. Idris used the lull the way a craftsman uses a break between cuts. He ate a ration bar, half unwrapped, consumed in 4 methodical bites, his eyes moving across the pass below with the calm attention of a man reviewing a project in progress. Not triumph, not relief, assessment. Veth'ari had seen men eat during battles. He had done it himself. But there was a quality to this eating that he could not parse, the absolute ordinaries of it, the complete absence of performance, as though the battle were the interruption and the ration bar were the actual business of the afternoon. "He is not afraid," Veth'ari said, and heard immediately how wrong that was. Not wrong in the way of an error, wrong in the way of an insufficient vocabulary. Fear was not the variable he was trying to measure. "No," said Veth'ari, "he is not anything we have a category for." She was recording everything. The Veth'ari diplomatic mission's log would carry this, in full, back to the convergence, the positions, the timing, the prepared ground, the ration bar. And she knew already that the council's analysts would watch her recording and reach the same conclusion Veth'ari was reaching now. And then, as he was doing now, quietly discard it and start again. The war is his material. The second wave's center pushed up the road and found the gap Idris had left them, the one gap, the one approach that seemed clear, and the charges in the road's drainage culvert went off in a sequence so precisely timed they sounded like punctuation. End of sentence. New sentence. Idris moved back to the first position. Veth'ari did not try to count the enemy down. That was the wrong accounting. He counted instead the hours. 2.5 since the column had left, 1.5 remaining. Veth'ari had attended the funerals of heroes. She had never attended the working hours of one. While the third wave reformed in the valley below and Idris rested his eyes against the scope, Veth'ari told the princess the oldest story of their people, the one about the god who fought alone, and why such a thing could only happen once, and only in myth. "In the beginning," said Veth'ari, his voice dropped to the cadence he had learned in the teaching halls of the Convergence's warrior tradition, where every lesson began and ended with the ancient account. "In the beginning, when the Veth'ari were still learning to be Veth'ari, there was a figure the texts called the first among divided. The name itself was the warning. This was a being who had been whole, who had been part of the great luminous web of their earliest community, and who had, through pride or grief or a madness, the texts declined to specify, chosen to separate, chosen to stand alone. The enemy came, the texts gave them no name, only a quality. They came as a pressure, a weight, a force that moved through the gas giant tempests like a second storm inside the first, and the first among divided went to meet them. Alone, without the network of bodies that made each Veth'ari a node in something larger than themselves. And for a time, said Veth'ari, and here his voice carried the weight of a man reciting something he has known since childhood, something worn smooth by repetition into the texture of truth. For a time, the god held. The accounts were specific on this point, not just held but exceeded. The first among divided performed, in solitude, what formations of 20 could not achieve. The ancient texts described movements, tactics, improvisations that no Veth'ari military academy had ever been able to fully reconstruct, because they were predicated on something the academy could not teach, the absolute, total willingness to be the only one. And then the god was unmade. Not defeated, not killed precisely. Unmade, the Veth'ari word, was from their theology of community, and it meant the severing of the self from the luminous web that connected all living things, which was, in their understanding, a kind of death more complete than the biological kind. The body might continue. The node was gone. The lesson, said Veth'ari, finishing, was not that the first among divided was weak or wrong or foolish. The lesson was that the universe had a structure, and solitude was not a viable position within it, and even gods, especially gods, could not fight their way clear of that fact. The lesson was this can only happen once, and only in myth. Because the universe corrects. Below the crevice, on the ridge, Idris lifted his eye from the scope and rolled his neck, a slow, vertebral rotation that Veth'ari's recording would later show lasted exactly 7 seconds, and then settled back to the scope. The third wave was beginning to move. Veth'ari finished the story. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a recitation fully completed, a silence that expected the traditional response, the acknowledgement, the ritual affirmation that the lesson had been received. Veth'ari said nothing. She was watching Idris below. He was humming again. She had begun to recognize the structure of it, not a melody exactly, but a rhythm, a pulse, almost architectural. She had directed her recording equipment to capture the audio specifically in the third hour after she realized it was consistent, after she realized it was not incidental. He hummed the same way, the ridge held the same way, the prepared positions held, as a structure under pressure that had been designed to hold. Her translator rendered the sounds as approximate phonemes and then gave up. Only the rhythm reached her. She recorded the rhythm. The third wave came up the road in 3 columns, wider spread, accounting for the failures of the first 2, and Idris let them come further before the first shot, because further was better for what he'd prepared in the long, quiet space between the second wave and now, in the 40 minutes while Veth'ari was telling a story about a god who had died to prove a point. Idris, apparently, had not received the theological memo. The first shot collapsed the lead column's coherence, not because of where it landed but because of what it revealed about the angle, an angle that should, by every reading of the ridge's geometry, have been impossible from any covered position. And in the second of recalibration that followed, the second shot came from a different angle entirely, and the third from a third, and the valley officers were making calculations again, frantically, about how many defenders were on this ridge. Veth'ari was making a different calculation. She was calculating how long a story had to run before the universe noticed it was a myth. Because the god in Veth'ari's account had been unmade, the texts were clear. The lesson was settled, ancient, the bedrock of everything the Veth'ari knew about war and community and the proper place of the individual within the luminous web of existence. And below her, on a ridge with no name on any map that mattered, a human man with 3 rifles and the patience of someone who had learned to calculate load tolerances was doing, in daylight in the present tense, what their oldest myth said could only happen once, and only in myth. Still alive. Still working. The light along Veth'ari's jaw and collarbones, and the backs of her long hands brightened, until it was nearly visible in the afternoon sun. Not a diplomatic brightness, not a formal one, not the measured luminescence she deployed in council chambers and treaty halls, but something older than diplomacy, something that the Veth'ari had been doing in the presence of storms since before they had words for it. Her people called it witnessing. Below her, between shots, the human reached into his kit without looking and produced the remaining half of his ration bar. He ate. The third wave broke on the ridge like water, on a thing that had been there longer than the water. The myth did not account for this. Veth'ari recorded everything.